Welcome to the WWC Advanced Group Design Standards, or RDD, training module focused on fuzzy regression discontinuity designs. You can access all the resources mentioned in this module through the WWC website at whatworks.ed.gov. This module discusses the fifth RDD standard, or the fuzzy RDD standard, which outlines additional requirements for reviewing studies that use fuzzy regression discontinuity designs. After completing this module, you will be able to define what a fuzzy regression discontinuity design is and how it differs from a sharp regression discontinuity design. You will be able to describe the WWC's fuzzy RDD standard and will know how to apply that standard when conducting a WWC review of a fuzzy RDD study. Before we describe the fifth RDD standard, we will begin by providing a brief overview of what is meant by a fuzzy RDD and how we go about calculating impacts from fuzzy RDDs. As discussed in this training series, a regression discontinuity design is an appropriate and potentially powerful causal research design when a program or policy allocates participants to conditions based on how they score relative to a cutoff value on some continuous forcing variable. There are two broad categories of regression discontinuity designs. The first is called a sharp RDD. In a sharp RDD, all participants receive their assigned intervention or comparison condition, meaning, for example, if students below a particular cutoff score are meant to receive an intervention and students above this cutoff are not meant to receive the intervention, then all students scoring below receive the intervention and none who score above do. Statistically speaking, the probability of receiving the intervention increases from 0 to 1 exactly at the cutoff. The second category of regression discontinuity designs are called fuzzy RDDs. In a fuzzy RDD, not all participants receive their assigned condition, which means the probability of receiving the intervention, if assigned to the intervention group, may be less than 1, and the probability of receiving the intervention, if assigned to the comparison group, may be greater than 0. Instead, there are what we call non-compliers, individuals who, for whatever reason, do not comply with their treatment assignment. Some individuals who should receive the intervention based on their score actually may not receive the intervention. These individuals sometimes are called no-shows. And some individuals who should not receive the intervention based on their score actually could receive the intervention. These individuals are sometimes called crossovers. In a fuzzy RDD, there may be only no-shows, only crossovers, or both, which we will discuss in greater detail in the coming slides. One of the greatest things about regression discontinuity designs is how visually intuitive they are. Here you see a visual representation of a sharp RDD. You can see that on the x-axis, we have the forcing variable, and on the y-axis, we have the probability of receiving the intervention. On the left-hand side of the cutoff value, represented by the dotted line, the probability of treatment is 1, while on the right side, the probability is 0. Conceptually speaking, this means that it is an individual's score on the variable x and only this score that determines receipt of the intervention. In contrast, let's examine a visual representation of a fuzzy RDD. Here, again, we have the forcing variable on the x and probability of treatment on y. However, we see that although the probability of receiving the intervention jumps up from what looks like about 0.75 to about 0.25 at the cutoff, the probability of intervention receipt is not 1 for all values of the forcing variable below the cutoff, and it is not 0 for all values above the cutoff. This means that something else in addition to an individual's score on the forcing variable determines intervention receipt. Again, in this example, we have both no-shows above the cutoff and crossovers below, but it may be the case that there is only one or the other. It is also common to see that the probability of intervention receipt is greater closer to the cutoff on the comparison side and lower closer to the cutoff on the intervention side, as in this example, because these are individuals on the margin, but that need not be the case. If the probability were flat at 0.75 below and flat at 0.25 above, this would still be a fuzzy RDD. Here we have another visual depiction of a sharp versus fuzzy regression discontinuity design. In this example, pretest is the forcing variable shown on the x-axis, and the cutoff for treatment is 50. Students with scores below 50 are assigned to the intervention, while students with scores above are not. On the y-axis, we have post-test scores. You can see in the graph on the left that all students with pretest scores below 50 are represented by blue triangles, indicating that they received the intervention, and all students with pretest scores 50 or above are represented by red circles, indicating that they are in the comparison condition. This is therefore a sharp RDD. The dashed line on either side of the cutoff is the regression line on either side. As you can see, there is a difference in average test scores at the cutoff, with students in the intervention group scoring approximately 5 points higher. But in the graph on the right, we can see that there are some blue triangles to the right of the dotted line and some red circles to the left. This means that there are non-compliers, both no-shows and crossovers. There is still a difference in the dotted lines at the cutoff though, demonstrating a positive effect of the intervention. Next, we will discuss how to calculate the impact in a fuzzy regression discontinuity design. To do this, researchers frequently employ an instrumental variable approach using two-stage least squares. Broadly speaking, an instrumental variable approach allows for a causal effect to be calculated by finding an exogenous variable that is associated with an outcome only through its association with intervention receipt. In a fuzzy RDD, the side of the cutoff is the instrument. Whether an individual falls just above or below a cutoff is associated only with the outcome because it influences the probability that an individual receives the intervention, as stipulated in the exclusion restriction. The impact is calculated as the ratio of two discontinuities at the cutoff. These are typically estimated using two regression equations. Here, let C be an indicator for the side of the cutoff, Fv is the forcing variable, and X stands for any other predictors. The first discontinuity is the impact on the outcome at the cutoff. This is the difference in the outcome between the intervention side of the cutoff and the comparison side of the cutoff, which is delta 1 in the first regression equation. The second discontinuity is the impact on intervention participation at the cutoff, which is beta 1 from the second regression equation. Then we divide the first discontinuity, the impact on the outcome at the cutoff, by the second discontinuity, the impact on intervention participation at the cutoff. And just to highlight again the difference between fuzzy and sharp RDDs, because the difference in intervention participation at the cutoff is 1 in a sharp RDD, and that is the denominator in this ratio. The causal effect for a sharp RDD is simply the difference in the outcome at the cutoff, as was described in earlier modules in this training series. Time for your first knowledge check in this module. Since 2002, all grade 3 students in Florida are required to meet the level 2 benchmark or higher on the statewide reading test to be promoted to 4th grade. However, there are several of what are called good cause exemptions that allow students to be promoted despite failing to score at the level 2 benchmark or above. For example, scoring above a certain threshold on an alternative test, passing a teacher portfolio, or being designated as an English learner. Researchers have used this natural experiment to examine the effect of third-grade retention on later outcomes, such as test scores, graduation, and suspensions. What type of RDD did the researchers use? Your response options are A. A sharp RDD, or B. A fuzzy RDD. You may want to pause the video to think about your answer. B is the correct answer. This is a fuzzy RDD. There are exemptions to being retained for students who fail to score at the level 2 benchmark. Therefore, the probability of being retained below the cutoff is not 1. Also, there is nothing stipulating that students who score at level 2 or above cannot be retained. Therefore, the probability of being retained above the cutoff is greater than 0. In short, there is something else other than just the student's test score that determines whether they are retained. Now that we have provided a general overview of fuzzy regression discontinuity designs and the methods used to estimate complier average causal effects in these types of designs, we now will discuss the WWC's fifth RDD standard, which is used for reviewing evidence from fuzzy RDDs. For studies that are eligible for review as an RDD, the WWC has 5 standards that are used for review evidence from RDDs, and ultimately used to determine whether study findings meet WWC standards without reservations, meet WWC standards with reservations, or do not meet WWC standards. For each of the 5 RDD standards, there is a series of criteria used to determine whether a study finding completely satisfies, partially satisfies, or does not satisfy the standard. For a study finding to receive a research rating of meets WWC standards without reservations, that finding must satisfy all 5 of the RDD standards. So, reviewing a fuzzy RDD requires evaluating the eligible study findings according to the first 4 RDD standards discussed so far in this training series, namely RDD Standard 1 on the integrity of the forcing variable, RDD Standard 2 on attrition and baseline equivalence, RDD Standard 3 on continuity of the outcome forcing variable relationship, and RDD Standard 4 on functional form and bandwidth. If a study finding satisfies all 4 of these RDD standards, then a reviewer also must evaluate it using the fuzzy RDD standard, or RDD Standard 5, with an important exception. The fuzzy RDD standard is waived for fuzzy RDD studies that calculate impact estimates using a reduced form model. In these reduced form models, the outcome is modeled as a function of the forcing variable, an indicator for being above or below the cutoff, and possibly other covariates, but the model does not include a participation indicator. This reduced form model is analogous to an intent to treat analysis in the context of RCTs. If a reduced form model is used to estimate the fuzzy RDD impact, the study finding must only meet the first 4 RDD standards to be eligible to receive the rating meets WWC standards without reservations. So, when reviewing a fuzzy RDD study against the WWC standards, it is important to first assess whether the researchers calculated impact estimates using a reduced form model. If so, then RDD Standard 5 can be waived. If not, then the reviewers will need to assess whether the finding meets RDD Standard 5. Let's now discuss RDD Standard 5. The fuzzy RDD standard includes 8 criteria, criteria A through H, that are used for reviewing evidence from fuzzy RDDs. For the ease of discussion, hereafter we will refer to these criteria as RDD Criterion 5A, 5B, 5C, and so on. This table, which can be found in the WWC Procedures and Standard Handbook, or the Handbook, summarizes the 8 criteria that are used to determine whether the study completely or partially satisfies the fuzzy RDD standard. You see here that to completely or partially satisfy the fuzzy RDD standard, studies must satisfy the first 6 criteria, and the last 2 criteria are what distinguishes whether a study completely or partially satisfies the standard, based on what approach the authors used to estimate their models. RDD Criterion 5A requires that the intervention participation indicator be a binary indicator for taking up at least a portion of the intervention, and that could, for instance, include a binary indicator for receiving any positive dosage of the intervention. The WWC does not synthesize evidence about the impacts of intervention dosage, so a study would not meet this criterion if it used a continuous dosage measure for participation. Next, RDD Criterion 5B requires that the model used to estimate intervention effects have exactly one participation indicator. The WWC does not currently have standards for evaluating fuzzy RDD studies that use more than one participation indicator. RDD Criterion 5C requires that the indicator variable for being above or below the cutoff value of the forcing variable is a binary indicator for the groups to which participants are assigned. RDD Criterion 5D requires that the same covariates be included in both the analysis that estimates impacts on participation and the analysis that estimates the impact on outcomes. So, for authors using two-stage least squares estimation, this means that the same covariates must be used in the first and second stage equations. RDD Criterion 5E of the fuzzy RDD standard states that there must be no clear violations of the exclusion restriction. The focus, no clear violations, is because it is not possible to verify the exclusion restriction empirically, but obvious violations of the exclusion restrictions can be identified. As discussed earlier, the exclusion restriction means that the only channel through which assignment to conditions can influence outcomes is by affecting take-up of the intervention. This slide notes common violations of the exclusion restriction. For instance, when intervention participation is defined inconsistently for the intervention and comparison conditions, if intervention take-up was defined as taking up all components of the intervention for the intervention group, but intervention take-up was defined as taking up any component of the intervention for the comparison group, this would be a violation of the exclusion restriction. Another common violation of the exclusion restriction is when the assignment to the intervention group changes the behavior of participants, even if they do not take up the intervention. For instance, assignment to the intervention condition of a remedial reading intervention might cause parents to seek out additional services for their children. In order to satisfy this criterion, there must be no clear evidence that assignment to the intervention influenced the outcomes of participants through channels other than take-up of the intervention. RDD Criterion 5F requires that the study provide evidence that the forcing variable is a strong predictor of participation in the intervention. So, in a regression of program participation on an intervention indicator and other covariates, the WWC operationally defines this as having a minimum F statistic of 16 or a minimum T statistic of 4. For fuzzy RDD studies with more than one indicator for being above or below the cutoff, see Module 9 in this training series for the minimum required first stage F statistic needed to meet this criterion. Next, RDD Criterion 5G requires that the study use a local regression or related nonparametric approach in which intervention impacts are estimated within a justified bandwidth, using one of 3 potential approaches: It is important to note here that the WWC defines a justified bandwidth as one that was selected using a systematic procedure described in a peer-reviewed journal or methodological article that describes the procedure and demonstrates its effectiveness. For example, cross-validation, the plug-in, and robust CCT procedures all would be considered justified bandwidth selection procedures. So, in the context of RDD Criterion 5G, the study must apply the justified methods using one of three approaches. The first acceptable approach is that a justified bandwidth selection procedure is used for the fuzzy RDD impact estimate, namely the impact ratio. Another acceptable approach is when the authors use separate justified bandwidths for the numerator and denominator, as long as both are selected using a justified approach. And finally, a third acceptable approach is when the bandwidth selected for the intervention impact estimate, the numerator, is not justified, as long as that bandwidth is smaller than or equal to a justified bandwidth selected for the participation impact estimate, the denominator. You may recall that for a fuzzy RDD finding to be eligible to receive the highest possible WWC research rating, the finding must meet RDD Criterion 5G. Thus, for fuzzy RDDs that do not satisfy RDD Criterion 5G, they can instead satisfy RDD Criterion 5H and still be eligible to meet WWC standards with reservations. For RDD Criterion 5H, the study can estimate the fuzzy RDD impact using one of two approaches. The first acceptable approach is to use a justified bandwidth for the intervention impact estimate, the numerator only, even if it is larger than a bandwidth justified for the denominator. The second acceptable approach is that the denominator is estimated using a best fit functional form, namely a functional form of the relationship between program receipt and the forcing variable that has shown to be a better fit to the data than at least two other functional forms. And this can be based on any measure of goodness of fit from the methodological literature, such as AIC or adjusted R-squared fit statistics. Now that we have discussed each of the 8 criteria used to review evidence from fuzzy RDDs, we can take another look at the summary table as a reminder of how those 8 criteria are used to determine whether a study completely or partially satisfies the 5th RDD standard. However, it is important to remember that the final WWC research rating for a fuzzy RDD finding will also incorporate information relevant to the other 4 RDD standards related to integrity of the forcing variable, sample attrition, and baseline equivalence, continuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship, and bandwidth functional form specifications. We now will walk through an extended knowledge check scenario to demonstrate the application of the 8 fuzzy RDD criteria. Throughout these questions, you may want to pause to think about your answers and consult the slides describing the study and the model for information pertinent to the questions. A U.S. state requires schools to retain third-grade students who do not perform at basic proficiency level on the state reading exam, thus making it pass-fail. However, some students who pass the reading exam may be eligible for an exemption and thus are not retained. Furthermore, teachers may also elect to retain students who pass the reading exam but are deemed in need of retention. Researchers used a fuzzy RDD to estimate the complier average causal effect of third-grade retention on students' subsequent academic performance on standardized reading achievement tests. Students are assigned to the intervention condition, retained, and comparison condition, promoted, based on a continuous numerical forcing variable. The students take a state reading exam with possible scores ranging from 0 to 100 with a cutoff value of 50. The researchers have access to state administrative records containing the actual state reading exam scores that were used to assign students to conditions. The researchers provide no indication that this cutoff value was used to assign students to any other interventions or services. The researchers estimate complier average causal effects using a two-stage least squares instrumental variables estimation. The first stage and second stage equations are as follows. The first stage estimates the probability of the student receiving the intervention being retained in the third grade, noted as R. Each student has either an observed value of 1 if they were retained, or an observed value of 0 if they were not retained. R is a function of a dummy indicator C for whether the student fell below the cutoff value on the forcing variable, which is 50 in the state reading example. F is the continuous measure of the forcing variable centered at the cutoff, so 50 becomes 0, 51 is 1, 49 is -1, etc. C times F allows the relationship between the forcing variable, reading score, and R, the probability of retention, to differ on each side of the cutoff. Z is a vector of student demographic characteristics such as age, gender, race, and prior year reading achievement. E is the error term. In the second stage, the researchers are estimating students' reading achievement in fourth grade, the outcome of interest. In the second stage, you can see that the equation is the same except that instead of C, a dummy indicator for whether the student fell below the cutoff value of the forcing variable, and R, for whether the student was retained in fourth grade, we have F, the continuous measure of the forcing variable, the interaction of F and the cutoff to allow for differential slopes, and Z, the vector of student characteristics, and finally an error term. Knowledge check 2. Based on the scenario described on the previous slides, would findings from the study meet RDD Criterion 5A? Namely, is there a binary participation indicator for taking up some portion of the intervention? Your response options are A, yes, or B, no. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Yes, these study findings would meet RDD Criterion 5A. The model does include a binary indicator for participation in the intervention, which is represented in the model as R. Students had a 1 if they were retained and a 0 if they were not retained, with no other values. Being retained is just a yes or no. There are no degrees of retention specified. Knowledge check 3. Based on the scenario described on the previous slides, would findings from the study meet RDD Criterion 5B? Namely, does the model include only one participation indicator? Your response options are A, yes, or B, no. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Yes, the study findings would meet RDD Criterion 5B. There is one and only one participation indicator included in the model, which is represented as R. Knowledge check 4. Based on the scenario described on the previous slides, would findings from the study meet RDD Criterion 5C? Namely, does the model include an indicator for being above or below the cutoff that is a binary indicator for the groups to which subjects are assigned? Your response options are A, yes, or B, no. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Yes, the study findings would meet RDD Criterion 5C. The model includes a binary indicator for being above or below the cutoff for the groups to which subjects were assigned, which is represented as C in the model. Knowledge check 5. based on the scenario described on the previous slides, would findings from the study meet RDD criterion 5D? Namely, are the same covariates included in the analysis that estimates the impact on participation and the analysis that estimates the impact on outcomes? Your response options are A. Yes, or B. No. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Yes, the study findings would meet RDD criterion 5D. The same covariates that are used to estimate the impact on participation in the first stage are used to estimate the impact on outcomes in the second stage. Knowledge check 6. In the same scenario described on the previous slides, the study authors stated that grade retention versus promotion was defined consistently for the intervention and comparison groups. The study authors also stated that many parents of retained students reported seeking supplementary reading tutoring and instruction after being notified of the student's failing grade on the Grade 3 reading exam. Based on this additional information, would findings from the study meet RDD criterion 5E? Namely, are there no clear violations of the exclusion restriction? Your response options are A. Yes, or B. No. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is B. No. The study fails to meet RDD criterion 5E. This is a violation of the exclusion restriction. The authors explicitly stated that parents of retained students sought supplementary reading tutoring after being notified of their students' intervention status. So, assignment to the intervention group changed the behavior of the participants even if they did not take up the intervention. This represents a clear violation of the exclusion restriction. Knowledge check 7. In the same scenario described on the previous slides, the study authors stated that they estimated the two-stage least squares model using a bandwidth of 16, which is 8 test score points on either side of the cutoff value of 50. The bandwidth was selected using an approved optimal bandwidth algorithm, which identified an optimal bandwidth of 16 for the impact on participation and a bandwidth of 24 for the impact on outcomes. The authors reported that the t-statistic for the instrument was 3.87. Based on this additional information, would findings from the study meet RDD criterion 5F? Namely, is there evidence that the forcing variable is a strong predictor of participation? Your response options are A. Yes, or B. No. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is B. No. The study fails to meet criterion F. The forcing variable is not considered a strong predictor of participation, which is defined in the standards as a minimum t-statistic of 4. Knowledge check 8. Based on the information provided for this scenario, would findings from the study meet RDD criterion 5G? Namely, is the fuzzy RDD impact estimated with a justified bandwidth? Your response options are A. Yes, or B. No. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Yes. The study does meet RDD criterion 5G because the impacts are estimated within a justified bandwidth. The bandwidths for the numerator and the denominator both were selected separately using a justified optimal bandwidth method, which is one of the acceptable approaches for selecting bandwidth. Recall that RDDs, whether they be sharp RDDs or fuzzy RDDs, can use individual or cluster-level assignment of units to conditions. When reviewers assess RDD Standard 5 for cluster assignment fuzzy RDDs, there are no unique considerations required. Namely, reviewers will assess study findings against RDD Standard 5 using individual level or cluster level data, depending on what type of data the researchers analyzed. Recall that some RDDs may report pooled impacts for some combinations of forcing variables, cutoffs, and samples where the data from each combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample are standardized and grouped into a single dataset for which a single impact is calculated. When reviewers assess RDD Standard 5 for fuzzy RDDs reporting pooled impacts, there are no additional considerations required. However, when fuzzy RDDs report aggregate impacts, there are a few additional considerations needed when reviewers are assessing RDD Standard 5. Remember that aggregate impacts are defined as those that are calculated as weighted averages of impacts calculated separately for every combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample. When assessing RDD Standard 5 for aggregate impact findings, the standard must be applied to every impact included in the aggregate. Any impacts excluded from the aggregate will be treated as attrition, with two important exceptions. Impacts may be excluded if they do not meet RDD Criterion 5E or 5F. The aggregate impact then will receive the lowest rating among all impacts. This concludes our module on the WWC's fifth RDD standard, or the fuzzy RDD standard. You are now familiar with all 5 standards used for reviewing evidence from RDDs. As shown in this table from the handbook, recall that for RDD study findings to be eligible to receive the highest research rating of meets WWC standards without reservations, the findings must completely satisfy each of the 5 RDD standards. But recall that RDD Standard 5 will be waived if the study authors used a reduced form model to estimate intervention impacts. For RDD study findings to be eligible to receive the research rating of meets WWC standards with reservations, the findings must partially satisfy each of the applicable RDD standards. Recall that in most cases, if findings from an RDD study fail to at least partially satisfy the RDD standards, review teams have an option of reviewing those findings under the QED standards to be eligible to receive the rating of meets WWC standards with reservations. However, this option is not available for fuzzy RDDs. And finally, findings from an RDD study will receive the research rating of does not meet WWC standards if they fail to at least partially satisfy the RDD standards, or if they fail to satisfy QED standards when the review team decides to pursue a QED route. Now that we have covered the 5 RDD standards, the next module in the training series will focus on the Study Review Guide, or SRG, that the WWC uses to review findings from RDD studies.